everybody. I'm Johannes Bauer. I'm the director of the Crowell Center for Media and Information Policy at Michigan State University. And it's a great pleasure for me today to welcome David Clark from MIT, where he is a senior research scientist at the MIT Computer Science and Artificial Intelligence Laboratory. At some level, I think David does not need any introduction. He is one of the architects of the internet, but we benefit from his tangible work and from his insights in many ways in our daily lives. He's one of the visionaries behind the end-to-end architecture of the internet. Served between 1991 and 1989 as the chief protocol architect and chaired the Internet Activities Board. But David is also a fantastic interdisciplinary researcher, and I'm not sure that everybody is fully aware of this. I am in eager study of your work, and what I appreciate that really has influenced my own work is the fact that you look at the economic dimensions, the social dimensions, and increasingly also of course the governance dimensions of the internet. And my reading of your work is that you are a consistent voice of reason, pointing out the strength of different governance modes that are adopted in the internet, but also some of the challenges, right? And this is not only a phenomenon that affects the internet, because essentially it's a history of all technologies, that any solution to a problem often creates another issue that needs a new solution. And you have been a persistent and inspiring and deeply reflective voice on those issues. So it's a great pleasure and an honor that you took the time to be available today to talk to us about the persistent insecurities of the internet infrastructure and why they persist, and perhaps we can explore what could be done about those as well. So David, the floor is yours. Welcome.
So thank you so much for that very nice introduction. That was very nice. Yeah, I might say why I wanted to give this talk. When Johannes said, what talk do you want to give? I proposed this one. And the reason is that I have a sense of frustration that there are parts of the cybersecurity challenge that are not getting adequate attention. So, the ones that I don't want to talk about today are the ones that are getting attention, which is vulnerabilities in nodes. And of course, that's a very important issue. Attacks on nodes can produce ransomware and data, thank you very much, data exfiltration. I don't want to talk about that, nor am I going to talk about how applications are designed. We clearly have poorly designed applications that are just malicious. We have applications that support risky behavior. What I want to talk about are vulnerabilities and flaws in the internet itself at a packet carriage layer. And the packet carriage layer is actually pretty simple on the internet. There are basically 5 things we could talk about. I'm going to leave out 2 of the ones in parentheses here. I just don't have time. Every one of these topics has a vulnerability. Addressing the vulnerability is that the source address in a packet can be falsified. But you can ask me about it if we have time at the end. I want to talk about the global routing protocol in the internet, which is the Border Gateway Protocol, or BGP, and the persistent vulnerability we have there. I want to talk about issues, in particular abuse of the domain name system. I want to talk about how we manage keys on the internet, vulnerabilities in the certificate authority system. And if you gave me another hour, I would talk about distributed denial of service attacks, but that would be tedious. So I just don't have time to do that. So the reason I want to focus on these issues is, first, they're foundational. Every application depends on them. Every application can get messed up if the routing is wrong. And the second one is, end nodes can't mitigate these problems. If you are very risk averse, you can spend a lot of money to harden your end node. You can put in all kinds of software to detect intrusions and prevent ransomware and so forth. You can spend money that's aligned with your interest to the degree you need to do so. But the problems I'm going to talk about here primarily cannot be mitigated at the edge. The things you can do, I have a list of them at the end, but these are systemic problems and they have to be solved in the internet. And that has really been the challenge. So I'm going to use the Border Gateway Protocol as an example here. So I'm going to go into this in some detail. The Border Gateway Protocol, or BGP, is the global routing protocol in the internet. The internet's made up of about 75,000 regions that we call autonomous systems, and we call them autonomous systems for a reason. They're independently operated. Comcast, AT&T, Verizon, Google, British Telecom, France Telecom. They make up the internet, and they have to exchange information among themselves so that a packet from one side of the network can find its way across to the correct destination. The protocol we use for that is Border Gateway Protocol, and here's how it works. Let's say that I'm autonomous system 3 down in the left-hand corner of this little picture. I have a block of addresses. We call them a prefix because the thing that defines a block of addresses is the first part of address is always the same. It's like the area code on a phone number or something like that. So, a prefix of 18.0.0/16 means that this is a block of addresses where the first 16 bits out of the 32 are all the same. And what I do is I say to my neighbor, who in this case is ASC, we gave them letters, not numbers here, but ignore that issue. And what I say is, I'm autonomous system 3, I have this prefix. And you send that message to ASC and it says, oh, okay, I'll send it on to my neighbors, which are in this case are B and A and a B and A and D. And in each case, C adds its identifier to that string so that you're laying down the message that flows across the network, and we call it a path vector because it's the series of ASs that will get a packet back to AS3. And these things propagate across the internet. Now, just so you have an intuition, autonomous systems often announce multiple prefixes. So in fact, there are about 800,000 of these things that are active at any one time. If you're a router in the center of the network, you're probably dealing with a table of about 800,000 of these. And when a packet highly optimized algorithms, you can actually look up and support 100 gig links, etc. That gives you a fair few microseconds to look up the entry in the table. Now, what's the vulnerability in BGP? The vulnerability in BGP is a rogue autonomous system can announce that it either holds a prefix or is on a path to a prefix that it actually doesn't own. It can say, I'm the path. And if people decide if other autonomous systems believe that announcement, the end result is the packets are lured into that region. So here's a picture of that. We have autonomous system 666, and it says, I have prefix 18.0.016, and the origin is AS666, and it tells D. Now D has to decide what to do. It's got two announcements. Which one does it pick? Does it pick the one from 3 via C, or does it pick the one from 666? One of the simple rules we used in the internet back in the days when people weren't malicious is pick the shorter path. Sort of like makes sense, right? Why don't you take the closest path? That means that D might prefer the path to 666, and anybody trying to reach, in this case, MIT, because that's our address block, would end up over in 666. This is the core vulnerability that we're dealing with in BGP. Now, are there actual harms? There have been some rather visible ones recently where people stole cryptocurrency using clever BGP hacks. If we have time at the end, and we may not, I actually have as a case study how they did this. I can walk you through the steps they did. It's worth making a comment on the side. Why did they go after cryptocurrency? Well, there's this old quote from Willie Sutton, which of course Sutton denies he ever said. When somebody asked him why he robbed banks, he said that's where the money is. But additionally, it's unregulated. So, if they rip off a bank, well, all kinds of things get triggered. But if they steal cryptocurrency, it's sort of like, well, that's too bad. So obviously, that's a hot topic these days. There's a lot of things going on as well. These are headlines that, again, my former grad student, Cecilia Testard, assembled this list of stuff. And you'll notice some of these are what are called route leaks, and that we can distinguish that. The idea of a route leak is we don't think they were malicious, but it screwed things up. When we call it a hijack, we think they were malicious and it screwed things up. We're polite to people when we don't think they're malicious and we call it a leak. But sometimes you can't tell. So there's a headline that says, large European routing leak sends traffic through China Telecom. Was that malicious? Was that a mistake? How long did it last? What was going on there? And I think it's important to understand that criminals steal money, but right now we have nation states being accused of hijacking, in particular in the current climate, which is let's find a way to hit China with a big stick. The fact that it looks like China may have done some hijacks, leaks, has escalated hijacking to the level of national security. And the US government's getting excited. I'll come back to this later, but but they haven't figured out what to do. And there's a real issue here. How can government try to deal with all the issues here, especially since hijacking is cross-border? So let me just dig down into this a little bit. But the first thing I want to say is this vulnerability was identified in 1982. It's 40 years and counting. And I find myself, God, that is ridiculous. Now, in the early days, this attack seemed unlikely. The guy who identified it basically assumed the only reason this problem would arise is that an implementer made a mistake. Then we finally figured out that, yes, it's not just that users are malicious. We figured out that operators of autonomous systems are malicious. That is to say, there are elements in the internet that are malicious. And at that point, we had a whole series of proposed solutions. And we sort of have an alphabet soup. I put a bunch down here. Industry has proposed these. Academics have proposed these. The Internet Engineering Task Force has proposed these. Why is there such slow progress? That's part of the issue I want to get at. One of the reasons is there's persistent disagreements about what we ought to do. Turns out this threat can manifest in multiple ways. There are different threats, the aspects of this threat. And people disagree about which the most important one is to deal with first. There's a second disagreement, which is, well, how important is this? Okay, so somebody stole $1 million worth of cryptocurrency. Well, who cares? Why should we bother to fix the problem? And what solutions are deployable in practice? And the ones that are deployable, are they actually effective enough they're worth deploying? The next issue that's really important is there are very important negative externalities here. The actors that would have to do something to prevent hijacking are the internet service providers. But they're not the ones that are harmed by hijacks. It's the end users that are harmed by hijacks. And the end user that may be harmed is not necessarily the customer of the ISP that's trying to make a decision. So it's really hard to quantify the benefit. And since there are, see the point above, people who say, oh, the benefit's not that important. Who cares about $1 million worth of cryptocurrency? It's hard to decide that you can push the ISPs to do something that basically is going to cost them money, but no benefit. It's a negative externality. It's a network externality. The next issue, which is actually very important, which is there's what I call the fear of unintended consequences. The point of the internet is availability. We want to get packets from here to there. What security does is stop things from happening. Now, you hope it only stops the bad things from happening. But what happens if you don't get the line exactly right in your mechanism design? If you're a little lax and you let a few bad things through, then everybody says, well, you wasted all my time. I spent all this money to put this mechanism and all you did was make the attackers jump a little higher, but they can clearly afford to jump that high. So it was a complete waste of effort. We're not going to do it. You have to tighten it up. So you tighten it up, and now it turns out that you begin to occasionally impinge on a legitimate activity. And the ISPs say, my prime directive is availability. You have messed up directability. I'm getting availability. I'm getting phone calls from people who are saying, I cannot do this legitimate thing. I'm going to turn this mechanism off. And you can't quite get the line right. I'll come back to that. The final point is the decentralized character of the internet means first, we have no option for effective leadership. There's no way that somebody can stand up and say, I'm in charge, we're just going to do this. Anything that happens is an emergent property of a very complicated, uncoordinated process. And I'll tell you a little bit about that too. When the Internet Engineering Task Force has a disagreement, how do they resolve it? The method I've identified here is called the dueling pundit method, where two very smart, articulate blowhards stand up and each denounce the other. Your idea is daft. That's the most idiotic thing I've ever heard. What's interesting is that is a dynamically stable state. There was a study committee in the IETF that went into that mode and stayed in that mode for 5 years before somebody finally noticed that it was completely dysfunctional, killed it off, and created a new group. And I actually asked one of the pundits in that committee, and he said, absolutely, I was prepared to stall this committee for 5 years to make sure that other guy didn't win because his idea was stupid. Of course, the other guy felt exactly the same way about this. Now, I'm a sort of a data-oriented guy. I do a lot of data connections. Some people may know I spend a lot of time collaborating with CADA out at UCSD with Casey Claffey, and we keep thinking that evidence-based security research might be useful. Now, they always dismiss data because they say, no, that just tells you what the attackers are doing today, but the attackers can jump a little higher. So why would you bother to measure what they're measuring the wrong data. But that's a debate we could have about the relevance of data here. Can we actually do evidence-based policy making here? Here's an important issue in this space. If I'm an autonomous system and I make an announcement into the internet, you can't tell by looking at it whether it's malicious. You need some independent information. You need ground truth, independent verification to know what announcement is valid. You just see says 666 says they're announcing this prefix. Maybe they're supposed to. How can you know? What do you know what's valid? Okay. That's been a problem for years. There's an emerging approach that's getting some traction. There is something called the resource public key infrastructure. It's a public key hierarchy. And the idea here is that if you own an address block, you are allowed to register what's called route origin authorization, or a ROA, which basically says, I'm the owner of this address block, and I assert, cryptographically signed, that AS3 is now allowed to announce this prefix. It might be AS12 is also allowed to announce it, but I didn't put in an entry for 666. So if I've registered a ROA, that announcement should be invalid. There are 5 regional internet registries on the internet which allocate addresses, so they know who should have authority to claim ownership. And each one of them hosts a database where owners of addresses can register ROAs. It's a little more complicated than that, but it's all protected by a cryptographic chain of trust. Now, what do we do with the cranky pundits? The simplest one was to see whether they could get rid of this with a slapdown. I won't tell you who said this, but he just said, oh, ROAs are daft. Nobody will do that. That was, Now, in fact, in the US, NIST tracks usage, and about almost 40% of the address space today is covered by ROAs. In Europe, the number is much higher. There's an interesting policy question there. That's because the registry in the United States, the RIR in the United States, has made it legalistically difficult to register and use their ROAs because they're afraid they're going to get sued because we're so litigious. So the US lags behind in the registration of ROAs because the guy that's responsible for holding them is scared of a lawsuit. Okay. Another complaint is ROAs are not accurate enough, and that's a serious issue. If I register ROAs and I get them wrong and people start dropping my announcements, then I've messed up availability. And for a long time, people said, no, nobody will ever use the ROAs, even if you register them, because they're scared of dropping legitimate traffic. But in fact, a while back, several big ISPs, starting with AT&T, started dropping announcements that were invalid. And of course, that caused people to start cleaning up their ROAs. Okay, fine. We can track over time. We can see the risk of erroneous blocking. It's not that bad. I pointed out the next criticism, which is you don't need to fix the problem. Our analysis, and this is done by my grad student, well, then grad student, now a faculty member at University of Georgia Tech, Cecilia Testart. She used some machine learning to identify between 400 and 900, depending on how you count, different criteria, autonomous systems that were serial hijackers. They were hacking IP addresses, not just once, but repeatedly over periods of perhaps a month up to years. And nobody could figure out what to do about it, which is an interesting comment in and of itself. Okay. But does it matter? What I really want to know is how harmful were these hijacks? Maybe they didn't matter. Okay. There is an interesting economic analysis, which is in the internet, that it is so cheap for attackers to carry out some of their attacks that they can make money, even if a very small percentage of the attacks succeed. So a statement like, 90% of these things were irrelevant, or 95% of these things were irrelevant. It may still be that guy made a lot of money. Okay. It's like phishing. Well, never mind. We won't talk about that. There's some more cranky complaints. The operational software is not stable enough. Well, that time fixes that. A more interesting comment is the RPKI will become an next target for attackers. And that was an interesting comment. Every mitigation makes its own vulnerability. That's true. And this question of whether we have solved all of the problem or only part of it. I'm not going into the technical details here, but there's 2 kinds of hijacks. There's an invalid origin hijack. ROAs, as described, stop invalid origin hijacks, but the way people talk about using them, they don't stop invalid path hijacks. And the question was, well, how important is that? And that triggered a huge debate. Again, data could help. I want to sort of take a different angle on this. How can we try to address this problem? If an individual ISP does something, it doesn't help that much. What we have to do is find some way to get a set of actors to agree to some enhanced operational practices. And notice I said in a region here, because it actually makes the most sense to say, can we improve the security of a region of the internet? Now, obviously, it would be better if we could improve the global security of the internet, but I can't do that if some of the actors in the system are known to be malicious. There's an industry consortium called the Mutually Agreed Norms for Routing Security, or MANRS. The last time I looked, there were about 648 ISPs that were in it. If you look at the practices they call for, the bar is fairly low, but the practices will limit hijacks and other problems. So this is a step in the right direction. It's getting an industry agreement on enhanced practices that will say, let's start to clean this mess up. Now, the reason I wanted to point this out is I want you to understand the specifics, but I also want to make the point that this is what I'm showing here is a dynamic, uncoordinated process, which is what happens in this highly decentralized world when we try to creep toward better security. And I say creep because we've been trying to do it for 40 years. And the second point is, again, enterprises at the edge have only a small control over this process. If you register your ROAs, you have no control over who's decided to look at them and decide to drop things. If we need some data analytics, you're not in a position to do that analytics. You have to hope that there's somebody out there, some volunteer, some government agency that cares enough and got some funding to do some analysis to figure out what's going on here. Okay. There are two groups that collect data about BGP. They actually collect routing data. One of them is called Route Views, it's at the University of Oregon. One is RIPE, which is the Regional Internet Registry for Europe. The system they have is called RIPE-RIS. And I can tell you that both of these activities are marginally sustained. Yesterday, I spent an hour on the phone with the director of Route Views talking about where they get their money. They're passing the hat. They live off $30,000 donations. It's a very marginal activity. And yet all of our knowledge about routing security depends on these activities. It's really hard in this space to sustain research and data collection, especially since nobody in the government has decided, well, yeah, maybe we ought to be collecting data and maybe we ought to be making it available to the research community. And maybe this ought to be an orchestrated activity. The other kind of data about BGP, of course, comes from the regional internet registries. And all of a sudden they discovered they had a new job, which is they had to store all of these ROAs. And they would say, wait a minute, I just got a whole new job. How am I going to get the money to do this? And there was some serious pushback from these guys saying, look, I have to run a high resilient system. It's got to be available. It's got to be resistant to attackers. That wasn't the business I thought I was in. I thought the business I was in was handing out addresses. A lot of dislocation in the industry as a result of this decision. So I'm going to summarize BGP and go on. After 30 years of bickering, I think ROAs may be a path forward. I think we don't need yet another protocol. That's a stupid idea. If you think about that alphabet soup I had on a slide earlier, what we need to do is tighten up operational practices. And again, I could talk about this for an hour, but I'm not doing that. I will point out that MANRS is supported by ISOC, but when you look inside, there's about one person paying attention to it. So again, it's not a big deal. It's really hard to get funding for data collection. You need data to see whether MANRS participants are actually doing what they said. We need to argue about the value of MANRS to convince people to do it. It's a very tangled space. So global systems with distributed control, this is the takeaway. It's now clear any global system with distributed control will have malicious actors in it. We have to figure out how to deal with that. Misaligned incentives and lack of coherent leadership, those are our fundamental challenges. Nobody owns this problem that I just described to you, so nobody can own the solution. And while the mitigations are actually quite costly. If you ask what a big ISP would have to do to implement some of these things, it's a significant amount. I mean, it's measured in 6 and 7 figure numbers. Like it's not like $100,000. And come back again and again to this point. Security can seem like the enemy of availability, okay? Because security stops things from happening, and you have to think about constantly what users care about is availability. And of course, every mitigation brings its own vulnerability. Let me jump on to the domain name system. I won't take quite so long here, and I'm going to talk about the certificate authority system, and I want to have some time, and I'm noticing how much time is going by, so this is awkward. The domain name system translates domain names, www.mit.edu, www.example.com, into an IP address. This is another system which is highly distributed. It's got two parts. One is how you buy a name. A registrant goes to a registrar, who's the retail face who actually gets the name registered in a registry. Then when you want to look up a name, your computer sends a message to what is typically called a recursive resolver. Your ISP might give you a recursive resolver. A Google and Cloudflare run recursive resolvers. Your corporation may run a recursive resolver. And it'll run around and look up the name. It'll go to the, if I want to look up www.mit.edu, it'll say, do I know where the namespace for edu is managed? Yes, I do. Do I know where the namespace for MIT is managed? Yes, I do. I'll go look it up. Do I know where MIT says www is? I finally got an IP address. That's why we call it recursive. And it'll give you back the name. Okay, so there's the registration as the name resolution. Now, we have two problems in this space. The first one is sort of old-fashioned security. Registries are systems attached to the internet. They're vulnerable to being penetrated, attacked, hacked. We can pull off social engineering. We can just find technical vulnerabilities. Attackers can go in and corrupt name address bindings. They can go in and create new bindings. But I wasn't going to talk about it because in some sense, while that's a serious problem, it's well understood. We understand all of the issues of end node vulnerability. What I wanted to talk about is this related issue, which is miscreants just purchase names for malicious purposes. Okay, there are lots of malicious names that are being used in the internet. If you want to be a spammer, if you want to do phishing, if you want to distribute malware, you probably need a website from which this stuff comes. If you have a website, you need a name for it. So it is DNS names that allow users to be misdirected. That's how you bring them in. They say, click this URL. Okay. So attackers purchase new names. And because defenders are always trying to find those names and disable them, attackers purchase those new names by the thousands. And what's interesting is some registrars in this space offer services. For example, they will sell you 1,000 names at a discount, or they have a lookalike service, like you give them a string like Facebook, and they'll give you 1,000 names that look sort of like Facebook, Facebook, or one of the letters is Cyrillic or something like that. I can't think of any use for that service except in support of malicious attackers. So what do they say when you ask them? They say, we sell names. We found people that want to buy lots of names. They're profiting from this ecosystem. So here's the flip side. Should the DNS be part of our defense tactic? Attacks are fairly complicated. So there's another big debate. If you want to disrupt phishing, if you want to disrupt the downloads of, let's say, ransomware, where along the attack chain, or what is sometimes called the kill chain, should we try to intervene? Should we try to intervene by identifying DNS names that are malicious and disabling them? Some people say yes, some people say no. And obviously, persistent disagreement is a great way to make sure you don't make progress. Now, just as an aside, I thought I'd give you some interesting facts here. The attacks that I'm talking about here have very short duration. If you look at hijacks, most of them last an hour or two. Some of them last 5 minutes. We're talking about something that comes in, happens, and goes away. It's not like it happens. As I say, some hijacks persist for months, like some of the ones that appear to have been sending traffic through China, but most of them are very quick. In the DNS, because defenders are detecting malicious URLs and blocking them, the dynamics here runs really fast. There's an organization called Interal Consulting, and there's some guys there that are pretty smart guys, and they figured out that the practical lifetime of a DNS name was 21 hours, less than 1 day. They estimated that on the average, the anti-phishing attackers identify that name and get it blocked and start blocking it in a little under 9 hours. So we're talking about something here which is an incredibly fast tactical engagement. And there's a really interesting question. Can we make tactical defense fast enough to be effective, or do we have to change the system? And there are lots of proposals for how we could change the system. Again, I'm not going to drill too far down into this. Some of them involve making it harder to buy names. Some of them involve damping the dynamics. One would involve, of course, identifying the registries and the registrars that are apparently actively supporting this and somehow try to drive them from the market. Now, the bad guys would just go somewhere else, but maybe driving them somewhere else could actually be to our advantage because we could make it easier to find them. I don't know. My proposal was just increase the price of names, and I was taken out behind the barn and say, that's price fixing. It's per se illegal under antitrust. You cannot do price fixing. And I said, could we have a fee, a fixed fee? And they said, well, notice it's international, so how are you going to impose a fee? One of the interesting questions which we're dealing with right now is, can you figure out who bought a name? You go to a registrar, a registrant goes to a registrar and buys a name. Do they know who you are? And will they tell you, sorry, does a defender know who they are? They didn't want to waste any of their time figuring out who was buying the names. You could buy names with a gift card. But then the GDPR came along and they said, giving away the names would be a violation of privacy. So by GDPR, we can't tell you who bought the name. Now, obviously, you can go to court, you can get a court order. 3 weeks later, you show up. Notice the average duration of an attack is less than 1 day. Saying you have to get a court order is a formula for failure. Now, what's interesting is the European Union got really pissed about this. And they said this was an abusive interpretation of the GDPR. This is not what we meant. And they've now put forth a regulation called the NIS, the Network and Information Security, NIS2, which for registries and registrars that function in the European Union, they impose a know your customer obligation on them. And they say, when the right people ask, you have to give them the name and you have to do it promptly. So they are trying to regulate registries and registrars so that defenders can figure out who registered the names. Now, another thing you can do, of course, is block more aggressively, but now you get into the space where you're chewing into availability. And of course, there are these people who say, just DNS blocking is the whole wrong idea. For example, why don't we just kill all spam, which well seems like another fool's errand, but we could try. Google has a system called safe browsing where they try to figure out which the wicked names are. But when you look up the URL, they just give you a warning in your browser. And apparently this is proving somewhat effective. The interesting question is, how quickly can they find the malicious name? And I don't know the answer to that question. So again, let me summarize a little bit in this space. The creation of malicious activity is a multidiscipline, is a complex multi-stage process. What business schools call the value chain of the production of criminal activity. And there are many possible places to intervene, which means, of course, disagreement. And those who profit, like the people who sell names, they may not want to help much. They're in the business. I mean, there's been a lot of pressure on the registrars to say, can you clean this mess up? And they say, we are not the police. We do not want to make judgments about what's malicious. That's not our job. Our job is to sell names. You figure it out. We're just going to go sell names. We make money selling names. It looks like it might be the total the DNS sort of ecosystem might be sort of like a $3 billion a year industry, which is tiny compared to some things. I just wanted to point out, these things get composed in complicated ways. So for example, you could do a BGP hijack to redirect somebody to a wrong authoritative name server, which then returns an answer to a recursive resolver, which will then cache it for a while. This has sometimes been called cache poisoning because they now have a recursive resolver has the wrong answer, and until it times out, which could take a day or two, they'll keep giving you the wrong answer. A very short hijack could contaminate a name for a day or two. It's a mess. Let me talk about the certificate authority system, which was the third system I wanted to dig down into. It's a key management system. I think most people have come across at least the existence of the certificate authority system. It's supposed to give you an end-to-end confirmation. You may have been misled by the DNS, you may have been misled by the BGP, but you get to the website, and what you get is you get a cryptographically signed statement that says, this is the URL you were trying to get to, this is the DNS name you're trying to get to, this is a public key associated with that. If that website has the matching private key, then you know you got to the right place. So it was supposed to be an end-to-end check around the DNS and the BGP and all of that. A certificate is a binding between a domain name and a public key. The owner of the domain name has a private key. Now that certificate is cryptographically signed, and it has to be signed by some third party. They are called certificate authorities. The CA, of course, has its own private key, which it uses. It has to go through some sort of verification to say, okay, well, did you actually own that domain name? I'll come back to that. Now, how do we know that the certificate authority itself is the real one? Well, there's got to be a hierarchy of CAs that sign the binding between that first CA and its public key, and so on. Eventually, you get to what's called a root certificate authority. And how do you know the public keys of the root certificate authority? The answer is they're bundled in with your browser. So that is actually the root of trust for this whole process. It's the decision by the browser vendors as to what root certificate authorities are trustworthy. This whole system is called the public key infrastructure, PKI. So what could go wrong with this, he says cynically? Well, one thing, of course, is an attacker can penetrate a certificate authority, just issue valid certificates. That's happened. There was about 10 years ago, there was a Dutch certificate authority called DigiNotar, who was penetrated by somebody who self-identified as an Iranian hacker, but everybody assumed it was the Iranian intelligence service, and they issued fake certificates for Facebook and Google, which they could then use to carry out man-in-the-middle attacks against their own citizens. And you're playing for keeps here. People die. Another problem is the certificate authority could deliberately issue an invalid certificate. The Chinese have asserted that it is their sovereign right to assign any IP address they choose to a name. So if they want to issue an IP address for Facebook or Google, which is the one they return within China, that's their sovereign right. Now, there's an organization called the CA Browser Forum that tries to identify untrustworthy certificate authorities. And what happened, of course, is that the CA Browser Authority threw China out of the trusted list, which is we talk about state-on-state action. This is basically a Google on China action, which is a rather fascinating thing. Another problem we have is the operational complexity of managing certificates cause websites to have invalid certificates. Typically what happens is they time out. And then users get these inexplicable warnings. You say, oh, you go to this website, oh, you may be hacked. Do you really want to go forward? We just throw this up to the user. And what we have done is train the users that clicking through these things is by and large benign. An expired certificate is almost always benign. So what we've done is trick users to ignore the warning signals out of the CA system, which means when it finally does throw a real warning, the users ignore it, click through, get screwed anyway, and completely destroyed the utility of the certificate authority system as an end-to-end check. And finally, attackers can exploit the DNS and BGP to fool the certificate system into issuing a valid certificate. Now, I know I'm running out of time here, but I want to go through this because this is such a fascinating problem. When you apply for a certificate, how should the certificate authority verify that you're actually you? If we make it easy, undoubtedly hackers are going to abuse it. If you make it hard, most people won't try. And what that means is most people don't use HTTPS. They just fall back on clear text HTTP. So there's been a real push to make it easy to get certificates. There's a place you can go get a free certificate called Let's Encrypt. They have to figure out that you are the owner of the website. And the way they do this is to say, it's all been architected into protocols, but basically what they say is, we want you to make a modification to your website, which means you have control of it. And we're going to check to see whether you made that modification to the website. If you made the modification to the website, you must control it. So then we're going to give you the certificate. So now what people do is they use a BGP hijack to deflect that verification step to a fake copy of the website, which of course the malicious actor controls. And when Let's Encrypt or somebody else says, make a modification to your website, the malicious actor modifies their MODI. They say, oh, okay, fine, I'll give you the certificate. And now you have a legitimate certificate to a malicious website. It doesn't matter how much trouble you, Mr. Facebook or so forth, go to have a robust certificate. If the browsers will accept the fake one, who cares? Now, there's an interesting problem here. The CA system is interesting because the CA browser forum will actually throw people out of the club. In the context of the DNS and the BGP, there has been no willingness to take malicious actors and throw them out of the club. So I think that is a question. Are we going to go in that direction? And again, the point I always make, users care about availability. They click through those warnings because otherwise they have no way to get their work done, and they need to get their work done. So let me just talk a little bit about making things better, and then I'm going to stop and see if we take some questions. You have to ask who has the motivation to act, who has the authority to act, who has the competence to act, what could they do? The Internet Engineering Task Force writes standards. They don't normally push for deployment of practices. They don't try to steer the industry. There are industry consortia such as Manners. People are trying to start a consortium now around the DNS called Kind DNS. As near as I can tell, the operators have zero interest in it. Governments are trying to figure out what to do. As I said, The EU is now leading with things like NIS2. The US is discussing, I'll come back to this. There are international treaty organizations like the Internet Telecommunications Union, the ITU. Most people are absolutely terrified of the idea that regulation could end up in that space because China could dominate it. And if you look at the tactical defense today, most of it's being done by private actors. It's like the entire internet is being policed by private security forces. And you might ask, by what authority do they do this? By what tools? Sometimes the malicious guys actually sue them and win. And that's a really interesting flip. Okay. If you look at what's happened in the government, a while back, the DHS killed off its research program. There's a part there called CISA. I'm being told by people that pay attention that they're actually somewhat comfortable with the competence that CISA is developing, but DHS has struggled in this space. NTIA is being pushed to take on a more central role. NIST plays some very specific roles here. They don't fund outside work. They participate in standard setting, and they do run a dashboard that shows you how much of the internet is protected by ROAs. The FCC is dabbling in this space. They recently put out a notice of inquiry as to whether the FCC should do something about routing security. And most people looked around and said, the FCC did that? By what authority? They have no expertise in the area. NSF looks at this stuff and said it's important, but it's not research. It's not our job to fund this. This is operational. Somebody else should be paying for this. If you want to do something new, different, exciting, transformative, we'll give you money. But if you want to continue to collect data, continue to study the same old problem, that's not our mission. The DoD says this is a Facilian problem. I have no idea what's going on in the intelligence community. That's right. But there's no agency that has any broad authority here. If you think about something like the Department of Transportation or health, and they're important societal sectors that have matching government organizations. And if you look at these, there's nobody that's got broad authority. Okay. Now, what could the enterprise do? They can register their ROAs. I didn't discuss protocol that secures the DNS called DNSSEC, but I would encourage people to use it. Here's a really interesting proposition. A lot of the problems we have today is that the browser has some sort of default ways, for example, of looking up DNS names. And maybe that doesn't match what you do. You as a provider of an application service have much more of a control over how security is done if you just stop using browsers and start giving people apps. And there's a lot of drift away from browsers toward apps because apps can be a lot more secure. For example, you can embed in your app a very restricted list of root certificate authorities that you're willing to use, as opposed to the 40 or 50 that are in the browser. You could say, I'll just use one. That's called certificate pinning. And of course, you can also try to just think about what would happen if you're hijacked and try to minimize the consequential damages. And I always encourage people to attack themselves. Red teaming is really important in this space. This is a final point. The internet, the way applications are being designed on the internet today is mutating. Applications are moving much closer. The touch points for applications are moving much closer to the users. They are using distributed cloud. They're using CDNs. If you look at something like Google, they attach to the public internet. It's something like 6,500 places. So many points of connection from users are very close. And what this means is critical traffic is not going that far across the internet. And what that means is you may be able to create what I would call a region of trust. If an autonomous path is very short, it's hard to hijack it because one of the default rules is take the short one. And if I'm a Comcast customer, if I go from Comcast to, let's say, Facebook, I've only gone across 2 autonomous systems. It's really hard to hijack that. So the changing character of the internet suggests that there may be a key performance indicator for endpoints, which is what percentage of your customers are within N, where N could be 1, 2, 3 hops, AS hops of a point where your server attaches to the internet, and how effectively are you routing your customers to the best touch point. And there's a mechanism in the internet that, again, I'm not going to go into, but it's called anycasting for high-risk applications. This may turn out to be an effective way to further prevent being hacked. So here are some final thoughts. Technical solutions. If you think security is a technical problem, you're wrong. This is a space of social dynamics, persistent disagreement, misaligned incentives, and disagreement is a great way to stall progress. Problems are global, politics is inevitable, tensions are fundamental. The internet's intrinsically decentralized as opposed to the applications, which you'll notice are almost all centralized today. Google, Facebook, Twitter, those are centralized. And email is becoming more centralized because it's easier to solve the problems and because it's easier to monetize. But the internet as a packet carriage layer is always going to be distributed. It's always going to include elements that are not trustworthy. And I think the rest of these points are sort of obvious. So I think the next slide was, well, I just have to vent a little bit as a researcher. The work we do here to try to improve this internet are not that costly. Data analysis, data collection, leadership, it's not flashy. NSF doesn't want to pay because it's not transformative. It needs ongoing recognition. A lot of the data that the research community would like to get is commercial. Everybody I know in this space spends too much time passing the hat. As I just spent an hour yesterday talking to the guy who runs route views, trying to figure out where he gets his money. It's a space where, because nobody's in charge, it is very frustrating to live. So this is hijacking Amazon. And in fact, there are two parts to this case study. Back in 2018, there was a 2-hour hijack of the Amazon domain name service, which is called Route 53. The hijacked address was announced by a small hosting service in Columbus, Ohio called eNet. The fake name server to which you were directed, as opposed to the actual Amazon name server, sent you gave you a false IP address if you looked up the name myetherwallet.com, which went to a server in Russia. The Russian site provided, as I said a minute ago, an invalid certificate. It was self-signed, but users clicked through it anyway. And then of course, they stole your credentials and stole all your cryptocurrency and so forth. This went on for 2 hours. And what's interesting is they hijacked the address block for Route 53, which is the Amazon DNS service. In that period of time, many other names were not resolved. So you think somebody might have noticed something was going on here. But it took 2 hours for this attack to be noticed, during which time a fair amount of cryptocurrency was stolen. So what had happened, of course, in this context, Amazon registered 5,000 ROAs, hoping, because they have lots and lots of address blocks, and they've actually integrated the registration of ROAs into their automated managed address management, so the ROAs are valid, and they put a great deal of effort into getting this right. So what happens next? In 2022, it is thought, perhaps by the same group, an address block belonging to Amazon was hijacked for 2 hours. Now you can say, wait a minute, they had ROAs. That's right. But remember what I said, a ROA doesn't help unless somebody looks at it. So the attackers hijacked a block of addresses, including the address for a very particular service whose name is cbridge-prod2-seller.network. You don't care about that gook, but it's part of the cryptocurrency exchange called Seller Bridge. This was announced by a hosting site. Many hosting sites are quite dodgy. Okay, this was announced by a hosting site in the UK. Their transit provider, who's Telia, who's a perfectly respectable big tier 1 ISP, did not properly to check that the AS number that QuickHost said it was using. What QuickHost did is said that I'm Amazon. They said, I have IP address, blah, 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 16509. Now, Telia might have known that on that particular link, the ISP on the other end is not Amazon. You're supposed to know your customer. And they say, I have thousands of customers. How can I care? How can I know my customers? I don't care what autonomous is. Why should I care? It's just too hard. Okay. Manners, if you executed the manners operational practices, it would have prevented this. But what they did is they hijacked the address. Then they went to a certificate authority in Latvia called Go Get SSL, and they got a legitimate certificate for this thing, which was called cbridge-prod2-seller.network. Now, what was stored on that server? This is a cryptocurrency system based on smart contracts. The thing you downloaded from that server was the smart contract. So when you went to the faked site, you downloaded the wrong smart contract. Then, once you have that certificate, then they do a hijack again, And now they start stealing money. But notice this is not, they're not deflecting the user to a fake website. The user's going to the real website. It's just that when he tries to execute the smart contract, it's flawed, so the money goes the wrong place. It was a fascinating attack. But interestingly, in this case, downloading the smart contract was automated. There wasn't a place where you pop up a dialog box and say to the user, peril ahead, do you want to go? In this case, an invalid certificate would have stopped the transaction dead. So they had to get a valid certificate. So they had to hack the certificate authority system to get it. Then they had to depend on the fact that Telia would not check and see that when QuickHost announced that it was Amazon, that Telia wouldn't notice. And it's a very complicated, entangled set of operations, and it worked. They stole quite a bit of cryptocurrency, and then they all ran away. And it all occurred, and this occurs within 2 hours. 2 hours, it's done and gone. They're over the hills, they're out of here. So, I think there's a lot of details you can talk about here, but I would say if ISPs don't know who their customers are, in particular, don't know the autonomous systems of their customers, that really takes away the power of ROAS. There was a complicated thing. They did some complicated things involving an insecure system for registering addresses called the IRR. I'm not going to go into the details here, but if you push Telia, they say it's costly, it's hard to know. I don't know who the ISPs. Maybe they just became Amazon. What this is what. And notice it doesn't matter whether your provider checks ROAS. It's whether the provider of the attacker checks the ROAS. So you can't control that decision.